Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. And I just love learning from our guests, people who have the courage and clarity to put their thoughts down on a piece of paper for the world to read. I commend that. And the book that we're going to be talking about today is called Grandmothers at Work, Juggling Families and Jobs. When I think back to my grandmas, I always went over to the house. I thought about how they cooked, how awesome they were as grandmas. And I never for once ever thought about their careers or what they did before they became grandmas or, before they retired. So when I'm looking at this book and I'm interviewing authors from all over the world, I start to analyze how that's becoming very uncommon. Now people are working till they're 65 and then maybe taking a part-time job. And I'm seeing it more and more in the workplace. So that's why I would love to talk to our guest today, Madonna Harrington Meyer. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Mike.
Well, start off with the genesis of the book. Why did you write this? I think you outlined it in the intro of the book, but maybe give us the breakdown.
I think we're all aware that women in their 20s and 30s are juggling children and jobs. And I think what we were not so aware of is how many women in their 50s and 60s and even 70s were juggling children and jobs.
Yeah.
It's one thing to work all day and come home and do laundry and chase a 2-year-old when you're 20 and 30. It's quite another to do that when you're 50, 60, 70, and maybe have chronic conditions like arthritis, or you maybe struggled with cancer or hip replacement, something like that. It changes what the work is really like when you're older and doing both of those things at the same time.
And this is more so about career-driven women who love to work, right? Or is this more
It's
about,
not,
okay.
yeah, yes, them and others as well. So for the book, I interviewed 50 older women who are both working and taking care of grandchildren. And some of them had very high power jobs. They were working in DC, they were flying around the world for their jobs, they were making a lot of money. But many of them actually had medium income jobs, and they're working because they need to be working. They're supporting themselves. If they have husbands, they're supporting them. And very often they're helping to pay for things for the grandchildren as well.
When you look back on maybe 50 years ago, it wasn't like this. There weren't a lot of women working at this age, right? It was still the guy, or maybe they were both retired, probably because they had the pension in place and certain, financial maybe disciplines that people don't have nowadays. But what's the difference between my grandmas and nowadays? Is there a major contrast?
This is not your grandma's grandma, for sure. We have this image of grandma walking around with an apron and a rolling pin and sitting in a rocking chair. Grandma's got a laptop. Grandma's got an yeah. She's got an iPad and she knows how to use it. So it is really a different situation. And part of this is because so many women work in their 20s and 30s and 40s, but it's also because so many women are working later into life. So women used to go into the labor force for 10, 20 years and then step out. And now we're seeing more and more women working well into their 60s. And we had a little down dip with COVID, but we're dipping right back. We're noticing it's going right back up.
And I think you have one of the stats in there that the average retirement age is, every 10 years is jumping up by like 2 years or something like that. So
have gone up quite a bit. They dipped down during COVID, as I mentioned, but they've gone back up. And also the age at which you become a grandmother is getting older as well. So it is still about 50, but we are seeing more and more people becoming first-time grandparents well into their 60s. So, for example, I'm about to turn 65, and I'm not yet a grandmother, and I'm not alone. There are many women who are waiting longer and longer. They're older when a first grandchild arrives.
And so, would you say that I was able to find some data that proves that maybe happiness is not increasing as much as the freedom and the rights that are given to women as they get older, or compared to maybe back in the 50s. Are you noticing any type of trend when it comes to state of minds or depression levels or happiness in general? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying the same?
If you talk to grandmothers about their grandchildren, they weep tears of joy. You've never seen as many happy tears as you have talking to grandmothers about their grandchildren. They're so happy to see them, so happy to take care of them. The first big chapter in the book is actually called Joy. I think it's the only sociology book ever to use the word joy, let alone make it be the heading of a chapter. But there's tremendous joy, and people talk a lot about the meaning of life, that it's the most important thing they've ever done. Taking care of their grandchildren gives grandmothers great joy. Now, not all of them, of course, but many, many of them.
Hmm. And I would say that due to inflation and the cost of everything, it's going up, which means that there's definitely a need to have supplemental income at this age as compared to before. Back in the day, 50s,
Right.
I believe a house cost $10,000, right? And so you could have one income, take care of everything past 65 years old. But now, cost of living, and maybe you can kind of bring to light some of the crazy costs. Not only does it cost more, but healthcare costs more. So they require more doctor's visits and maybe certain things that they need to take that do drain the bank account. So what is happening?
Well, I think several things are happening. One is that sometimes women really love their jobs and they want to keep working because the job is meaningful, it's important work, their friends are there, their social lives are pivoting around their work. So sometimes that's a big part of it. And part of it is they do not have enough money tucked away in their nest eggs. Their retirement planning hasn't gone as well as they had hoped. Some of it is they don't yet own their home and they need to pay that off. And some of it is they're bankrolling the other generations. They're giving an awful lot of money to their children and their grandchildren. So some of the grandmothers I interviewed could have retired, but they continue working so that they've got enough money to be able to pay for saxophone lessons for the grandchildren or a house cleaner for the household or that sort of thing. So there's a combination of all those things. It's also difficult to retire before the age of 65 because Medicare doesn't start till you're 65. You can't get Medicare unless you have a disability before age 65. So there's often this window between maybe 55 and 65 where people might like to retire, but health insurance is too expensive for them to be able to afford it without working.
Well, on the cover of your book, you have an individual at the computer with a baby next to them
Yeah.
at the office. And when I see that, I'm thinking to myself, man, how is that possible whenever you have, and that's probably a common thing where people have these careers and they still have these responsibilities with their grandkids. Probably they want to be with their grandkids that you bring so much joy. But there is something happening with this. I don't know if is it Gen Z or Gen X that nowadays the new generation is not doing as well as the previous generation, right? So it's wild how the income levels now, or they're staying at home longer, or they're not more financially secure. So grandmas and grandfathers are needing to step in much more, right? So that's a common trend also. And I'm
Right,
assuming
right,
you ran into that.
right. You've hit it right. You've hit the nail right on the head there. There's a tremendous intensification of grandparenting. So in the old days, being a grandma meant taking the kids to the zoo, maybe having dessert before dinner, maybe, staying up late to watch a movie, eating popcorn in a room you weren't supposed to eat popcorn in. And now being a grandmother very often means meeting the bus, bringing them home, helping them with dinner, helping them with homework, doing their laundry, making their lunches for the next day, tucking them in. So I talked to many, many grandmothers who were doing very intensive care work, and they were struggling with algebra, and they were struggling with calculus, and they were struggling with how difficult some of the schoolwork was that they were expected to help with. And so we're seeing a tremendous intensification of grandparenting. Grandparents' jobs are looking more and more like mothering jobs. So many of the grandmothers said to me, I wish I could just wear my grandma hat. I don't have time to take them to the zoo. I'm so busy taking them to the doctor and to PT and to OT and to this and to that and to the lessons that I don't have time to actually just be a grandma. I don't have time to just sit and read the book that I want to read to them. We're so busy getting things done.
Wow, with all this technology, all these resources, and they're not gaining time. So
No.
is it in alignment with just my generation potentially vacating responsibility or making poor decisions? What's happening?
So I'm not going to say that, not at all. So I think one of the things you see in a book like this is diversity. So some families, the adult children are making wonderful decisions, but their jobs are very demanding. They're expected to be at the office 60 hours a week, and somebody's got to pick up the slack with those children. Daycares are only open for so much of the day. Somebody's got to get those kids off the bus. Somebody's got to pick up the slack. So that's one answer is some people have extremely demanding jobs. Another answer is we have a huge increase in single parenting. So we have a lot of single moms. So there's no parent to hand off duties with. In my household, one of us put the kids on the bus, the other one got the kids off the bus. And so we could shift our two schedules to accommodate. But if there's only one of you, there's nobody to shift with. And so you might rely on grandma much more if you're a single parent as well. So I just wanted to mention one other thing. Grandparenting is intensifying, and we're seeing some grandmothers stay at work longer so that they don't have to provide as much childcare. So they're saying, I could have retired, but I'm going to keep my job for another 5 years until all the kids are in first grade, because I don't want to be providing quite this much grandchild care. I'm happy to take them on weekends and evenings, but I don't want to have them all day every day. So I also saw grandmothers staying at the jobs longer in order to use it as a way to set some limits.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point there. The single parent household is definitely increasing, right? Divorce rates, but people are having kids and they're not staying together, or they're not even getting married, right? That's what's happening. So who else is going to take them whenever the individual needs to earn an income? That person goes to work, and somebody has to be responsible for the baby. Now, there's probably something else that's happening here, and maybe you could touch on it. Women obviously have fallen in love with their careers. Are they wanting to stay at their career, therefore not wanting to stay home with the kid, and therefore giving the kid to the grandma for them to be more responsible for the baby while they go out and earn a living, even though there are two parents at the house, both of them working?
I think some women and some men are in love with their careers and want to be at their careers rather than home with the children. And I also think that some jobs expect you to be there whether you are in love with the job or not. And so some jobs are just very demanding and they control your schedule quite a bit. I think that it can go both ways. I think a lot of women wish they had more flexibility, more ability to maybe be part-time, but their employers won't allow that kind of thing, or they might like to work from home a little bit more. So I think there's a lot of different answers to that question, a lot of diversity in the answers to that question. Some women really love their jobs and some really don't, but they need to support their families. They need work.
And obviously your book is tailored towards grandmothers. Whenever you interview them, what exact are the grandfathers still working? Are they right. What's happening on that side?
When I started the project, I thought that I would interview both grandmothers and grandfathers. And what I found was that while there are plenty of grandfathers who help out and take care of the grandkids, they're usually not still working. So I was looking at this intersection of still working and watching the grandkids. And that's where I just found women. I didn't find men doing both. I found men retiring and then pitching in, retiring and taking care of the grandkids, but not so much working and then still taking care of the grandkids. Now, there were a few exceptions, but not too many. One of the things I noticed was that some adult children really took advantage of their parents, of the grandparents. So, for example, there are some very sad stories, and I call them lifelines in the book, where the grandmother is really saving the day. So there was a story about a young man, he and his girlfriend got pregnant in high school, they got married, they got divorced, and now the grandchild goes back and forth between them. So the son has the grandson every other weekend. And grandma would call over there and she said, I could hear the party raging. And what do? Do I leave him there or do I go get him? So of course she would go get him and bring him to her house for the weekend, which now meant her son was free to party all weekend because he now no longer had responsibility for his grandson. So I never asked about enabling, but a third of my grandparents mentioned it, that their adult children were taking advantage of the care they were providing, to party too late, to stay out too late, to not come home on time, to go out with their friends rather than watch their children, that sort of thing. So there was about a third of the grandmothers mentioned their concern that they were enabling their children to be kind of crummy parents, not really the best parents.
Now, when I think of individuals getting older, personally, I mean, my career is tied to my identity. There's no doubt. I love it. And so I think there is something that to be said about purpose and drive. And I'm assuming some of these individuals you work with, like you said, they love their career, but it's their identity. So even if they go from full-time to part-time, it gives them some type of purpose to wake up and be valuable to the world. So I'm assuming it's not just a money thing, but hey, it's who I am, and I gain my identity by going to work. And that's probably something very difficult for people to let go of at 65, 70, 75, when that's all you've known your entire life.
Right. And let me actually just move this along to a slightly different but related topic. One of the things I look at is what is the impact of being both a grandmother and an employee when you're, in your 50s and 60s and 70s and doing all this work? And what is the impact on your social life? So I found that part very interesting in the book. Some of these grandmothers have protected their social life. They still get together once a month with their college friends. They still get together with their bridge club. They would never miss a night at the volunteer group, activity. They really protect their own social lives. Some of these grandmothers have rewritten their social life to be entirely about their family. So they don't see their college friends anymore. They don't see their grad school friends anymore. They don't see their old friends from work anymore. They just go to the t-ball games and the baseball games and the soccer games and the choir concerts and the dance recitals and the birthday parties. And all they do is they've completely rewritten their lives to be focused on their families and specifically on their grandchildren. And finally, some of them have almost no social life at all because they are just too exhausted. So I talk to people who've been working all day and taking care of the kids every evening for 17 years. That's a long time to be an evening parent, right? Imagine doing that in your 60s. And so I interviewed people who were doing that. So some of those people were just so tired. One woman told me her best friend is her bed. One woman said, if I was given a safari in Africa, a free safari in Africa, I would turn it down and stay home and sleep in my bed. So I know. So for some people, they're able to protect their own social lives and really have this wonderfully rich, balanced life. And some of them have redefined what it means to have a rich, balanced life, to be just their own family. And some of them have really had to forgo almost everything because they are worn out. They're exhausted by how much work they're doing. One time when I was talking about this with students, I was calling it care work. And I was saying, when grandma comes over and she takes care of you, that's work. And this student had a really bad face. And I finally said, what's the matter? And she said, you're calling this work. And I said, I am calling it work. Yes. And she said, but when my grandma makes my grilled cheese sandwiches, she always looks so happy.
My grandma was
And
the same way with grilled
I
cheese
know, I can tell
sandwiches. I
that.
still think of my grandma and mac and cheese.
Yeah. So I said, well, when you babysit, do you ever smile? And she said, well, of course, I love the kids I babysit. I said, so does that mean you don't want paid? And she said, well, no, of course I still want paid. And I said, exactly. So because it's work. And even though you love it, like what you're doing right now, the $1 million book, you love this job, but you also want to be paid. And it's not that grandma wants to be paid, but I think it's important to recognize that grandma is really doing work. And that at the end of the day, grandma is sometimes really exhausted.
In your through your perspective, when you see this, I mean, I look at my family and my grandma was the head of the family, just so you know, like
The
she was.
matriarch.
Yep, she was the matriarch. I mean, you had to get grandma's permission. Everybody knew it. She ran the family. So when I think of the classical family, I really do believe back in the day and even to this day, the man wakes up and says, I need to work and I need to provide. But the mother, the grandmother, is the nurturer. There's nothing I can do. She's going to nurture the family way better than I can. So let her do her thing. Are we getting away from that? And is that a good thing? Because I believe a grandma is a nurturer by nature. That's probably the best way to put it. And
So I think you and I have pretty different views on this.
Okay, so tell me what you think about it,
Right.
because I'm looking
So
at my classical family, and it was
yeah,
a structure that I believe the society is getting away from.
I would agree that we are moving somewhat away from the old traditional roles. You're describing a traditional gendered division of labor where men work and women stay home and take care of children. And yes, we've moved away from that. Women are working and men are taking care of children. So when you look at time use studies, you see that men are doing more around the house. Now, they're not doing half, but they're doing more. And they're doing more care work for frail older relatives or for children. Not half, but more. And we're seeing women doing less of those things as they're doing more paid employment. So we're seeing some move toward equity, but we're nowhere near equity on any of it. So we are seeing some move toward that. So what I found was that some of these grandmothers, so for example, according to the Healthy Retirement Study, of all the women who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who have grandchildren and who have a job, 50% of them are doing both. That means 50% are choosing not to.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the 50% who are choosing not to are not in my book, because that's not the book I wrote. Somebody else could write that book. But it just, and what I want to remind everybody is grandparenting is not for everyone. It's not for everyone. Just like mothering is not for everyone. It's not something that's going to give everyone pleasure, and not everyone is going to be good at it. So I had one grandmother who, she said when she was young, she was raised by a nanny. Her parents were always at work and she was raised by a nanny. When she raised her daughter, she had a nanny for her daughter. Then when her daughter had the grandchildren, she expected this woman to stay home and take care of the grandchildren. And she's like, I didn't stay home to take care of you. Why would I stay home to take care of the grandchildren? I got a nanny, get a nanny. And so they really struggled with it a lot. And she said it was very hard to define a role that was acceptable to her daughter, but was acceptable to her, because she was still working and doing very important work. So she said she invented this thing called ride-alongs. So every couple of days, she would get in the car and drive to the school and pick up both of the granddaughters, and then take them to whatever appointments they had. If they had swim lessons, or if they had flute lessons, or if they had a doctor appointment. And then she said, we just ride and talk. And she would drive them around to all their after school activities. And they really never got out of the car other than to go in and do their things. But it gave her a role in helping to raise these grandchildren, but it also let her work and travel as much as she needed to for her job, which it seemed like a good compromise to me.
Wow. So throughout your studies there, it sounds like when these grandmothers love to do both. And so
a lot of them.
Yeah. And
some of them are so tired they want to go to bed. But
okay.
Yeah. Right.
I didn't know if it was like an art of delegation or mastering the art of balance. And
right.
Maybe that's tough for some people. But when I look back on my grandma and grandpap, it was like my grandma didn't want to work, right? She loved going to play bingo and going shopping with my mom and all that. So like deep inside, it was just instinctive, like, oh, she didn't want a career. And my grandfather loved being a stagehand for movies and whatnot. So it was like, that's what I saw. And it seems like we're getting away from that simply because I believe women are becoming more career driven, whether it's good or bad. That, you know, everybody goes after what they want. Some people, and I've talked to a woman recently, and she said, you know what my dream job is? Just being a stay-at-home mom, right? And I think nowadays that's sounding like, oh, well, you're a gold digger. No, that's the classical tradition, right? So like, are women being demonized from doing that? Or do you think it's more so that they're being taught, you know what, you need to be a career woman? What are you noticing and what are you thinking whenever it comes to these grandmas? Are they loving their position, or are they, you know, regretting some decisions? What are your thoughts?
Right. So what I saw was that women seemed to fare best when they were themselves flexible, but also when they worked for a boss that was flexible. So if they were willing to rearrange their schedule because it's a snow day or a sick day or an early release day at school, that worked out best. And if their boss was willing to let them as well. So I talked to one woman who worked at a law firm, and she said, there's 5 of us who answer the phones, and we are all grandmothers. And she said, we set our schedules side by side, and we say, okay, you leave early Tuesday for your t-ball game, you leave early Wednesday for your choir concert, and then we'll all leave early Thursday for the volleyball game. And she said sometimes they would just forward the law firm's phone to one of their cell phones, and they'd be at the game answering the phone, hello, so and so, so and so, and so and so. And she said they felt very confident because they'd all worked there for a long time and they were indispensable. And she said there's not one of those lawyers who can really answer the phone. They don't know how. So she said they're not going to fire us. So I think there was a tremendous sense among many of the grandmothers who'd been at their jobs for a long time that they were very valued and very highly rewarded and very important to the place where they worked. And they weren't precarious. They didn't feel precarious at all. By contrast, many of them mentioned that their daughters were in more precarious employment positions. So I'm thinking of a daughter who had recently gotten divorced, and she'd gotten a new job, which paid better, which was great, but she was on probation. And so she couldn't miss a single day of work, or she was at risk of being completely let go. And so I saw grandmothers with more job security talking about granddaughters who were in more precarious situations. So the grandmothers were pitching in to cover until the daughters were in more rock solid employment positions because they're supporting themselves and their families.
Did you notice that there are certain advantages to, I mean, like hiring grandmothers?
Oh, yeah.
I believe that they know themselves, they know their schedule, they're they have something to lose, right? They love that stability, but they don't need to go out and explore the world, so they're not going to jump from one company to the next. And I think that the world is opening up to hiring older people. Maybe it's not, you're not across the board, but I'm starting to see a lot more acceptability to it. So there's a lot of
Right.
benefits to hiring grandmothers. Is that right?
Hiring older people in general, absolutely. And we certainly saw this after COVID when we had real labor shortages. There was a tremendous renewed interest in hiring older people. I personally think one of the smartest things you can do as an employer is have an age integrated workforce. Employers have a tendency to hire a bunch of 20-year-olds or a bunch of 40-year-olds or a bunch of 60-year-olds. But really, an age integrated workforce makes a lot of sense because then you have people with different strengths, different weaknesses. They bring different things to the table. And so I think in general, hiring workers from each decade, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that all makes sense to me as an employer. I'm not an employer, but research suggests that age integrated is a good way to go, and that older workers really add a lot of value to a work site. There are many studies of companies that hire only older workers and they thrive.
Yeah. I'm looking at my company and I have a woman who's, and this isn't old. I realize I'm 39, but an individual who's early 60s, and she's talking daily with an individual who's 23 years old. And I think it's a sense of leadership, really, more so than anything else that she has within the company. And it's great to see. And I believe that I don't think she's a grandma, but there's a sense of leadership and the ability to say I've been here, I've done this, and I see there's a lot of potential because of her perspective. And I think a
Right.
lot of people should take advantage of that. Hire older people in your organization because they do see certain advantages that other people don't.
I think so too. One of the most difficult things that I ran into in interviewing people was some of the financial impacts. So, as I mentioned, sometimes grandparents are bankrolling the younger generations. And so they're paying for tremendous amounts of things. They're paying for textbooks, scientific calculators, UGG boots, band camp. They're paying for Spanish camp. They're paying for all kinds of house cleaners. Sometimes they're having meals delivered. I saw grandparents paying for, if you can name an item that happens in a household, I had a grandparent pay for it. There's nothing you could mention. Diapers, formula, clothing, tennis lessons. The list was endless. Now, sometimes grandparents have a great deal of money and it's easy for them to afford to do this, right? We saw this during the pandemic. They took the whole family on a cruise, that kind of thing. Those are grandparents I'm not too worried about. But when grandparents sometimes have fewer resources and they're still bankrolling a lot of these expenses, they bite away at their own retirement nest egg. And I saw many people who had taken on new debt. So
Hmm.
they had been trying to save money, and now here they are approaching their own retirement, and they're actually taking out a second mortgage on their house, or they're using their retirement savings to help their daughter get through a divorce or their son get through a difficult business situation. So I saw people taking on new debt, and that means many things. They're taking on new debt. It adds a lot to their anxiety and their worry, but it also means they're usually going to delay retirement, and it often means they're going to delay medical care. It means they're going to delay travel, fun things. Some of them need to move to a simpler housing situation. They can't afford to do so. So I saw some really serious consequences for people who were taking on too many financial consequences because they were helping bankroll that younger couple of generations so much.
When you were doing research for this book, did you notice that maybe society's going in the wrong direction? Maybe the family structure is breaking down or getting flipped upside down. Anything that really scares you amongst some of the data or some of the stories that you're seeing on a common, or I guess, on a common basis?
Well, I think I come at this from maybe a different angle than you do, in that I tend to focus on the kinds of programs the US could provide but does not provide. So we could make sure that everybody has paid vacation through their job, but we don't. We could make sure everybody has paid sick days through their job, but we don't. We could make sure everybody has health insurance through their job, but we don't. We could make sure that there's universal pre-K all around the country. All of these things would provide tremendous support to families of all ages, and they would help grandmothers as well if we have these things in place across the board for everyone. and not just the people who were sort of lucky enough to have a good job that provided those things. So if you have a really nice job, then your nice job will provide you with paid vacation days, paid sick days, a pension plan, and health insurance. But if you're doing gig work or you've got a lower paying job or a job that's less stable, you're not likely to have any of those benefits. And then that makes it really difficult to juggle your work and your kids, makes it harder for grandma to juggle work and kids, that kind of thing. So I tend to focus there. Those are my concerns, I think, that we could have programs in place that would make it easier, just a safety net that makes it easier for all the families across the board.
I never even thought about this, but what percentage of grandmas out there are on their own through divorce, right? Obviously, people pass
Right,
away and they don't ever get remarried, but is
right.
it pretty common amongst the 50 that you interviewed?
It is. A lot of the grandmothers are single moms, and the moms are single moms as well. So sometimes we have two generations of single women helping to try to raise, this next generation. And I also had grandmothers who moved in order to be more available. So they lived in California, but they moved close to where their daughter was in, like, say, Missouri or Mississippi. And they gave up their job out there and they got a new job. And often it's not as good of a job. It doesn't have as good of benefits. So one woman who had been a nurse at a hospital and she had very good benefits gave that up because she needed to work per diem so that she could take care of the grandchildren. If you're a per diem worker, they say, will you come in tomorrow? And you can say yes, and you can say no. So you can look at the weather forecast and say, it's going to be a snow day. I'll say no, and I'll stay home with the grandkids. So she got more flexibility, but she lost her paid vacation. She lost her paid sick leave. She lost her health insurance, and she lost her pension plan. So she gave up all of that financial security in order to be available to take care of the grandchildren for her daughter. And I had several stories like that where people moved and changed jobs in order to be more available. And the financial consequences of that can be pretty severe.
Yeah, it's just when you just said that, it's so interesting that you never even think about a single grandma raising a single mom.
Who
And
has, right.
I've interviewed people who talk about the number one way of showing if someone's going to have success financially and stay out of the legal system is if it's a two-parent household. Usually that's a secure base point. So I don't know if you've ever done any research on that, but it's pretty wild that single family households, it's almost like you need that yin and yang, and you need the mother and the father. So is that alarming at all? Do you think that, or do you see any type of trend of obviously you didn't study the kids, but when it comes to a two-party household at all that leads to financial success or staying out of the legal system or being in trouble with the law, anything like that? Does that scare you? Anything that shocks you?
I would say what I noticed mostly was sometimes when the grandmothers were married, the grandfathers helped, and sometimes they just didn't. So sometimes we had grandpa who was retired and he would pitch in. There was one really adorable story about a grandfather. She said he never changed a single diaper when we were raising our children, not one. But now as grandpa, he's like elbowing everybody out of the way, feeding everybody down the hallway because he's determined to change every diaper. So I saw some things like that. I saw some really hands-on, wonderful grandparenting. But I also saw some grandfathers who simply were unwilling to pitch in. They didn't want to help. They didn't want to do it. And frankly, they were mad that she was doing it. So I'm thinking of this one couple where they had made an agreement that they would be snowbirds and move from Wisconsin to Florida. And she was so busy helping with the grandkids, she said, I can't go to Florida. I'm taking care of these kids almost every day after school. And he would not come and help. And he was irritated that she wasn't home having dinner with him and irritated that she didn't keep her part of the deal and move to Florida with him as like a retired snowbird. So I saw a lot of different types of grandfathers. I also saw some grandfathers who were quite ill and would have loved to pitch in but couldn't. So one of the things to remember is grandma might be taking care of the grandchildren, but she might also be taking care of her husband if she has one. Some of the husbands had Alzheimer's disease. Some of them needed hip replacements or knee replacements. Some of them had pretty severe disabilities, bad backs, that kind of thing. And grandmother might also be taking care of her parents or his parents. So we call those the sandwich generation, right? These grandmothers who are taking care of their parents, their children, and their grandchildren. I call them the club sandwich because it's 3 layers that they're helping to take care of. But that was one of my biggest concerns was grandmothers who were taking care of so many generations of people. And when you think about taking care of your parents, you have a mom and a dad. And if you have a husband, he has a mom and a dad. That's 4 whole older people who might need your care at some point. That's a lot of people.
Wow. Last question I have for you. One of the great entrepreneurs out there, helps people start businesses. His name's Patrick Bet-David. And he was talking about, and I don't know if it's the exact story, but he set his wife up so she has her own separate bank account, never has to ask for any type of money, whatever. She has her own career, but they have 2 separate bank accounts, I believe. And I don't know what that does, but if you've seen anything amongst grandma and grandpap having 2 separate bank accounts for a healthy marriage, healthy setup, because if they have their own careers, maybe they have their own bank accounts. Do you have any insight on that? Have you seen that done? Do you think it's a wise decision?
I did not ask anything about what kinds of bank accounts the grandparents had. I did ask a lot of questions about if they're both helping or if only one of them is helping. And there were lovely stories where they were really on the same page and they were both pitching in and both really taking care of the grandchildren. And then other stories where only she was. So there was a big amount of variation in how much the grandfathers were helping. But there were lovely grandfather stories where grandfathers were pitching in and really doing a lot. I didn't ask about their bank accounts.
Got it. I was wondering if
Can't
there's
help
any
you with that one.
trend between just keeping it separate so you have your own thing, but we're still in a union. So interesting. Last question, I guess I have a book outside of your own book that you recommend for our readers, our listeners, our viewers. Is there anything that sticks out that maybe changed your life, maybe got you to fall in love with this subject, or just reading or writing in general? A book that stands out in my life is a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It pretty much changed my whole life. It's why I'm here. So anything like that for you?
I can't think quickly enough. I read so many books. I'm not sure. Not sure. I don't have one right off the top of my head. Sorry about that.
Well, that means you're an avid reader, by the way. When
I am an
somebody
avid reader.
can't
I have
say
so
it,
many. I can't
there's
think
too many. That's actually a good thing, right?
Right.
Well, outside of buying your book on Amazon, any website, any social media that you want to promote, if anybody's interested in this topic, maybe for you to come and speak at their event or have you on their podcast?
Right. I'm very easily findable on through Google at Syracuse University. I'm in the Maxwell School for Social Citizenship and in the sociology department in particular. And for people who really care a lot about this topic, I have another book written with Inez Abdul Malik called Grandparenting Children with Disabilities. Wow. And that spun right out of this book. I kept running into grandmothers who were saying that their grandchild had disabilities and needed all kinds of therapies. And so I just stopped and did a whole book on just the grandparents who were taking care of children with disabilities. And that was a very intensive set of grandparenting stories. Some of them are doing tremendous amounts of work. Yeah. Yeah. And loving it, loving their grandkids, loving such joy.
It's interesting you write this book because I don't see too many people write on this topic, right? Grandmothers, grandfathers, just the elders in the workplace. And I look at my grandma and grandpapa on both sides of my family. They were like royalty. Like, I don't know if that's still around today, but like you respect your elders, but when you went over there, you were on your best behavior, but also you could always get grandpap to do a little something, right? Give you a little extra food or play with you a little bit longer and let you get away with things. And so, it made me think of my grandma and grandpa before we met on this call, and obviously since then. So I'm
delighted that it made you think about your own. So many people come to tell me their personal stories about their grandparents. It's lovely.
Oh, I know. You're in a busy work schedule constantly. You don't think about when you were a kid and having grandma and grandpa cook you mac and cheese. It's such an awesome memory. And yeah, you made me think of that. So thank you so much for being on the $1 Million Stories podcast.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate your time. Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.
Thank you, Mike.